The Bath Chair by E.F.Benson and read by Christopher Halton. Edmund Faraday, at the age of 50, had every reason to be satisfied with life. He had got all he really wanted, and plenty of it. Health was among the chief causes of his content, and he often reflected that the medical profession would have a very thin time of it if everyone was as fortunate as he. His appreciation of his good fortune was apt at times to be a little trying. He ate freely. He absorbed large but in no way excessive quantities of mixed alcoholic liquors, pleasantly alluding to his immunity from any disagreeable effects, and he let it be widely known that he had a cold bath in the morning, spent 10 minutes before an open window doing jerks and flexings, and had a fine appetite for breakfast. Not quite so popular was his faint contempt for those who had to be careful of themselves. It was not expressed in contemptuous terms. Indeed, he was jovially sympathetic with men perhaps 10 years younger than himself, who found it more prudent to be abstemious. "Such a bore for you, old man," he would comment, "but I expect you're wise." In addition to these physical advantages, he was master of a very considerable income, derived from shares in a very sound company of general stores, which he himself had founded, and of which he was chairman. This and his accumulated savings enabled him to live precisely as he pleased. He had a house near Ascot, where he spent most weekends from Friday to Monday, playing golf all day, and another in Massington Square, conveniently close to his business. He might reasonably look forward to a robust and prosperous traverse of that tableland of life, which with healthy men continues till well after they have passed their 70th year. In London he was accustomed to have a couple of hours bridge at his club before he went back to his bachelor home, where his sister kept house for him, and from morning to night his life was spent in enjoying or providing for his own pleasures. Alice Faraday was in her own department one of the clues of his prosperous existence, for it was she who ran his domestic affairs for him. He saw little of her, for he always breakfasted by himself, and encountered her in the morning only for a moment when he came downstairs to set out for his office, and told her whether there would be some of his friends to dinner or whether he would be out. She would then interview the cook and telephone to the tradesman, and make her tour of the house to see that all was tidy and speckless. At the end of the day again, it was but seldom that they spent a domestic evening together. Either he dined out leaving her alone, or 3 friends or perhaps 7 were his guests, and made up a table or 2 tables of bridge. On these occasions Alice was never of the party. She was no card player. She was rather deaf. She was silent and by no means decorative, and she was best represented by the admirable meal she had provided for him and his friends. At the house at Ascot she performed a similar role, finding her way there by train on Friday morning, so as to have the house ready for him when he motored down later in the day. Sometimes he wondered whether he would not be more comfortable if he married and gave Alice a modest home of her own, with an income to correspond. For though he saw her but seldom, her presence was slightly repugnant to him. But marriage was something of a risk, especially for a man of his age who had kept out of it so long, and he might find himself with a wife who had a will of her own, and who did not understand, as Alice certainly did, that the whole reason of her existence was to make him comfortable. Again he wondered whether perfectly trained servants like his would not run the house as efficiently as his sister, in which case she would be better away. He would indefinably be more at his ease if she were not under his roof. But then his cook might leave, or his housemaid do her work badly, and there would be bills to go through, and wages to be paid, and catering to be thought of. Alice did all that, and his only concern was to draw her a monthly cheque with a grumble at the total. As for his occasional evenings with her, though it was a bore to dine with this rather deaf, this uncouth and bony creature, such evenings were rare. And when dinner was over, he retired to his own den, and spent a tolerable hour or 2 over a book or a crossword puzzle. What she did with herself he had no idea, nor did he care, provided she did not intrude on him. Probably she read those gruesome books about the subconscious mind and occult powers which interested her. For him, the conscious mind was sufficient, and she had little place in it. A secret, unsavoury woman. It was odd that he, so spick and span and robust, should be of the same blood as she. This regime, the most comfortable that he could devise for himself, had been practically forced on Alice. Up till her father's death she had kept house for him, and in his old age he had fallen on evil days. He had gambled away in stupid speculation on the stock exchange a very decent capital, and for the last 5 years of his life he had been entirely dependent on his son, who housed them both in a dingy little flat just around the corner from Massington Square. Then the old man had had a stroke and was partially paralysed, and Edmund, always contemptuous of the sick and the inefficient, had grudged every penny of the few £100 which he annually allowed him. At the same time he admired the powers of management and economy that his sister manifested in contriving to make her father comfortable on his meagre pittance. For instance, she even got him a second-hand bath chair, shabby and shiny with much usage, and on warm days she used to have him wheeled up and down the garden in Massington Square, or sit there reading to him. Certainly she had a good idea of how to use money, and so, on her father's death, since she had to be provided for somehow, he offered her £100 a year, with board and lodging, to come and keep house for him. If she did not accept this munificence, she would have to look out for herself, and as she was otherwise penniless, it was not in her power to refuse. She brought the bath chair with her, and it was stored away in a big shed in the garden behind her brother's house. It might come into use again some day. Edmund Faraday was an exceedingly shrewd man, but he never guessed that there was any psychical reason, beyond the material necessity, why Alice so eagerly accepted his offer. Briefly, this reason was that his sister regarded him with a hatred that prospered and burned bright in his presence. She hugged it to her, she cherished and fed it, and for that she must be with him, otherwise it might die down and grow cold. To hear him come in of an evening thrilled her with the sense of his nearness. To sit with him in silence at their rare solitary meals, to watch him, to serve him, was a feast to her. She had no definite personal desire to injure him, even if that had been possible, but she must be near him, waiting for some inconjecturable doom, which, long though it might tarry, would surely overtake him, provided only that she kept the dynamo of her hatred ceaselessly at work. All vivid emotion, she knew, was a force in the world, and sooner or later it worked out its fulfilment. In her solitary hours, when her housekeeping work was accomplished, she directed her mind on him like a searchlight. She studied books of magic and occult lore that revealed or hinted at the powers which concentration can give. Witches and sorcerers in the old days, ignorant of the underlying cause, made spells and incantations. They fashioned images of wax to represent their victims and bound and stabbed them with needles in order to induce physical illness and torturing pains. But all this was child's play, dealing with symbols, the driving force behind them which was much better left alone to do its will in its own way without interference, was hate. And it was no use being impatient. It was patience that did its perfect work. Perhaps when the doom began to shape itself, a little assistance might be given. Fears might be encouraged. Despair might be helped to grow. But nothing more than that. Just the unwearied waiting, the still intense desire, the black unquenchable flame. Often she felt that her father's spirit was in touch with her, for he too had loathed his son, and when he lay paralysed without power of speech, she used to make up stories about Edmund for his amusement, how he would lose all his money, how he would be detected in some gross dishonesty in his business, how his vaunted health would fail him, and how cancer or some crippling ailment would grip him. And then the old man's eyes would brighten with merriment, and he cackled wordlessly in his beard and twitched with pleasure. Since her father's death, Alice had no sense that he had gone from her. His spirit was near her, and its malevolence was undiminished. She made him partner of her thoughts, Sometimes Edmund was late returning from his work, and as the minutes slipped by and still he did not come, it was as if she still made stories for her father and told him that the telephone bell would soon ring, and she would find that she was being rung up from some hospital where Edmund had been carried after a street accident. But then she would check her thoughts. She must not allow herself to get too definite or even to suggest anything to the force that was brewing and working round him. And though at present all seemed well with him, and the passing months seemed but to endow him with new prosperities, she never doubted that fulfilment would fail if she was patient and did her part in keeping the dynamo of hate at work. Edmund Faraday had only lately moved into the house he now occupied. Previously he had lived in another in the same square, a dozen doors off, but he had always wanted this house. It was more spacious, and it had behind it a considerable plot of garden, lawn and flower beds, with a high brick wall surrounding it. But the other house was still unlet, and the house agent's board on it was an eyesore to him. There was money unrealized while it stood empty. But tonight, as he approached it, walking briskly back from his office, he saw that there was a man standing on the balcony outside the drawing-room windows. Evidently then there was someone seeing over it. As he drew nearer, the man turned, took a few steps towards the long open window and passed inside. Faraday noticed that he limped heavily, leaning on a stick and swaying his body forward as he advanced his left leg, as if the joint was locked. But that was no concern of his, and he was pleased to think that somebody had come to inspect his vacant property. Next morning, on his way to business, he looked in at the agent's, in whose hands was the disposal of the house, and asked who had been inquiring about it. The agent knew nothing of it. He had not given the keys to anyone. "But I saw a man standing on the balcony last night," said Faraday. "He must have got hold of the keys." But the keys were in their proper place, and the agent promised to send round at once to make sure that the house was duly locked up. Faraday took the trouble to call again on his way home, only to learn that all was in order, front door locked, and back door and area gate locked, nor was there any sign that the house had been burglariously entered. Somehow this trumpery incident stuck in Faraday's mind, and more than once that week it was oddly recalled to him. One morning he saw in the street a little ahead of him a man who limped and leaned on his stick, and instantly he bethought himself of that visitor to the empty house for his build, and his movement were the same, and he quickened his step to have a look at him. But the pavement was crowded, and before he could catch him up the man had stepped into the roadway and dodged through the thick traffic, and Edmund lost sight of him. Once again, as he was coming up the square to his own house, he was sure that he saw him walking in the opposite direction, down the other side of the square. And now he turned back in order to come round the end of the garden and meet him face to face. But by the time he had got to the opposite pavement there was no sign of him. He looked up and down the street beyond. Surely that limping, crippled walk would have been visible a long way off. A big man, broad-shouldered and burly in make, it should have been easy to pick him out. Faraday felt certain he was not a householder in the square, or surely he must have noticed him before. And what had he been doing in his locked house? And why suddenly should he himself now catch sight of him almost every day? Quite irrationally he felt that this obtrusive and yet elusive stranger had got something to do with him. He was going down to Ascot tomorrow, and tonight was one of those rare occasions when he dined alone with his sister. He had little appetite, he found fault with the food, and presently the usual silence descended. Suddenly she gave her little bleating laugh. "Oh, I forgot to tell you," she said. "There was a man who called today, didn't give any name, who wished to see you about the letting of the other house. I said it was in the agent's hands. I gave him the address. Was that right, Edmund?" "What was he like?" he rapped out. "I never saw his face clearly at all. He was standing in the hall with his back to the window when I came down. But a big man like you in build, but crippled, very lame, leaning heavily on his stick. What time was this?" "A few minutes only before you came in." "And then?" Well, when I told him to apply to the agent, he turned and went out, and as I say, I never saw his face. It was odd somehow. I watched him from the window, and he walked around the top of the square and down the other side. A few minutes afterwards, I heard you come in." She watched him as she spoke and saw trouble in his face. "I can't make out who the fellow is," he said. "From your description, he seems like a man I saw a week ago, standing on the balcony of the other house. Yet when I inquired at the agent's, no one had asked for the keys, and the house was locked up all right. I've seen him several times since, but never close. Why didn't you ask his name or get his address?" "I declare I never thought of it," she said. "Don't forget, if he calls again. Now, if you've finished, you can be off. You'll go down to Ascot tomorrow morning and let us have something fit to eat. 3 men coming down for the weekend." Faraday went out to his morning round of golf on Saturday in high good spirits. He had won largely at bridge the night before, and he felt brisk and clear-eyed. The morning was very hot, the sun blazed, but a bastion of black cloud coppery at the edges was pushing up the sky from the east, threatening a downpour, and it was annoying to have to wait at one of the short holes while the couple in front delved among the bunkers that guarded the green. Eventually they holed out, and Faraday, waiting for them to quit, saw that there was watching them a big man leaning on a stick and limping heavily as he moved. "That's he," he thought to himself. "So now I'll get a look at him." But when he arrived at the green, the stranger had gone, and there was no sign of him anywhere. However, he knew the couple who were in front, and he could ask them when he got to the clubhouse who their friend was. Presently the rain began, short in duration but violent, and his partner went to change his clothes when they got in. Faraday scorned any such precaution. He never caught cold, and never yet in his life had he had a twinge of rheumatism, and while he waited for his less robust partner, he made inquiries of the couple who had been playing in front of him as to who their lame companion was. But they knew nothing of him. Neither of them had seen him. Somehow this took the edge off his sense of well-being, for indeed it was a queer thing. But Sunday dawned, bright and sparkling, and waking early he jumped out of bed with the intention of a walk in the garden before his bath. But instantly he had to clutch at a chair to save himself a fall. His left leg had given way under his weight, and a stabbing pain shot through his hip joint. Very annoying. Perhaps he should have changed his wet clothes yesterday. He dressed with difficulty and limped downstairs. Alice was there arranging fresh flowers for the table. "Why, Edmund, what's the matter?" she asked. "Touch of rheumatism," he said. "Moving about will put it right." But moving about was not so easy. Golf was out of the question, and he sat all day in the garden, cursing this unwanted affliction, and all day the thought of the lame man in build like himself scratched about underground in his brain like a burrowing mole. Arrived back in London, Faraday saw a reliable doctor who, learning of his cold baths and his undisciplined use of the pleasures of the cellar and the table, put him on a regime which was a bitter humiliation to him, for he had joined the contemptible army of the careful. "Moderation, my dear sir," said his adviser. "No more cold baths or port for you, and a curb on your admirable appetite. A little more quiet exercise too during the week, and a good deal less on your weekends. Do your work and play your games and see your friends, but moderation, and we'll soon have you all right." It was in accordance with this distasteful advice that Faraday took to walking home if he had been dining out in the neighbourhood, or, if at home, took a couple of turns around the square before going to bed. Contrary to use, he was without guests several nights this week, and on the last of them, before going down into the country again, he limped out about 11 o'clock, feeling ill at ease and strangely apprehensive of the future. Though the violence of his attack had abated, walking was painful and difficult, and his halting steps, he felt sure, must arrest a contemptuous compassion in all who knew what a brisk, strong mover he had been. The night was cloudy and sweltering hot. There was a tenseness and an oppression in the air that matched his mood. All pleasure had been sucked out of life for him by this indisposition, and he felt with some inward and quaking certainty that it was but the shadow of some more dire visitant who was drawing near. All this week, too, there had been something strange about Alice. She seemed to be expecting something, and that expectation filled her with a secret glee. She watched him, she took note, she was alert. He had made the complete circuit of the square, and now was on his second round, after which he would turn in. 100 yards of pavement lay between him and his own house, and it and the roadway were absolutely empty. Then, as he neared his own door, he saw that a figure was advancing in his direction. Like him, it limped and leaned on a stick. But though a week ago he had wanted to meet this man face to face, something in his mind had shifted, and now the prospect of the encounter filled him with some quaking terror. A meeting, however, was not to be avoided unless he turned back again, and the thought of being followed by him was even more intolerable than the encounter. Then, while he was still a dozen yards off, he saw that the other had paused opposite his door, as if waiting for him. Faraday held his latchkey in his hand, ready to let himself in. He would not look at the fellow at all, but pass him with averted head. When he was now within a foot or two of him, the other put out his hand with a detaining gesture, and involuntarily Faraday turned. The man was standing close to the street lamp, and his face was in vivid light, and that face was Faraday's own. It was as if he beheld his own image in a looking-glass. With a gulping breath, he let himself into his house and banged the door. There was Alice standing close within, waiting for him, surely. "Edmund," she said, and just as surely her voice trembled with some secret suppressed glee. "I went to post a letter just now, and that man who called about the other house was loitering outside. So odd." He wiped the cold dews from his forehead. "Did you get a look at him?" he asked. "What was he like?" She gave her bleating laugh, and her eyes were merry. "A most extraordinary thing," she said. "He was so like you that I actually spoke to him before I saw my mistake. His walk, his build, his face, everything most extraordinary. Well, I'll go up to bed now. It's late for me, but I thought you would like to know that he was about in case you wanted to speak to him. I wonder who he is and what he wants. Sleep well." In spite of her good wishes, Faraday slept far from well. According to his usual custom, he had thrown the windows wide before he got into bed, and he was just dozing off when he heard from outside an uneven tread and the tap of a stick on the pavement. His own tread, he would have thought, and the tap of his own stick. Up and down it went in a short patrol in front of his house. Sometimes it ceased for a while, but no sooner did sleep hover near him than it began again. Should he look out, he asked himself, and see if there was anyone there? He recoiled from that, for the thought of looking again on himself, his own face and figure, brought the sweat to his forehead. At last, unable to bear this haunted vigil any longer, he went to the window. From end to end, as far as he could see, the square was empty but for a policeman moving noiselessly on his rounds and flashing his light into areas. Dr. Inglis visited him next morning. Since seeing him last, he had examined the X-ray photograph of the troublesome joint, and he could give him good news about that. There was no sign of arthritis. A muscular rheumatism, which no doubt would yield to treatment and care, was all that ailed him. So off went Faraday to his work, and the doctor remained to have a talk to Alice, for jovially and encouragingly he had told him that he suspected he was not a very obedient patient, and must tell his sister that his instructions as to food and tabloids must be obeyed. "Physically, there's nothing much wrong with him, Miss Faraday," he said, "but I want to consult you. I found him very nervous, and I am sure he was wanting to tell me something, but couldn't manage it. He ought to have thrown off his rheumatism days ago, but there's something on his mind, sapping his vitality. Have you any idea, strict confidence of course, what it is?" She gave her little bleat of laughter. "Wrong of me to laugh, I know, Dr. Inglis," she said. "But it's such a relief to be told there's nothing really amiss with dear Edmund. Yes, he has something on his mind. Dear me, it's so ridiculous that I can hardly speak of it." "But I want to know." "Well, it's a lame man whom he has seen several times. I've seen him too, and the odd thing is, he is exactly like Edmund. Last night he met him just outside the house, and he came in, well, really looking like death." "And when did he see him first?" "After this lameness came upon him, I'll be bound." "No, before. We both saw him before. It was as if, such nonsense it sounds, it was as if this sort of double of himself showed what was going to happen to him." There was glee and gusto in her voice, and how slovenly and uncouth she was with that lock of grey hair loose across her forehead and her uncared-for hands. Dr. Inglis felt a distaste for her. He wondered if she was quite right in the head. She clasped one knee in her long bony fingers. "That's what troubles him. Oh, I understand him so well," she said. "Edmund's terrified of this man. He doesn't know what he is. Not who he is, but what he is." "But what is there to be afraid about?" asked the doctor. "This lame fellow, so like him, is no disordered fancy of his own brain, since you've seen him too. He's an ordinary living human being." She laughed again. She clapped her hands like a pleased child. "Why, of course that must be so," she said. "So there's nothing for him to be afraid of. That's splendid. I must tell Edmund that. What a relief. Now about the rules you've laid down for him, his food and all that. I will be very strict with him. I will see that he does what you tell him. I will be quite relentless." For a week or two Faraday saw no more of this unwelcome visitor, but he did not forget him, and somewhere deep down in his brain there remained that little cold focus of fear. Then came an evening when he had been dining out with friends. The food and the wine were excellent. They chaffed him about his abstemiousness, and loosening his restrictions, he made a jolly evening of it, like one of the old days. He seemed to himself to have escaped out of the shadow that had lain on him, and he walked home in high good humour, limping and leaning on his stick, but far more brisk than was his wont. He must be up betimes in the morning, for the annual general meeting of his company was soon coming on, and tomorrow he must finish writing his speech to the shareholders. He would be giving them a pleasant half-hour. 12% free of tax and a 5% bonus was what he had to tell them about Faraday's stores. He had taken a short-cut through the dingy little thoroughfare where his father had lived during his last stricken years, and his thoughts flitted back with the sense of a burden gone to the last time he had seen him alive, sitting in his bath chair in the garden of the square, with Alice reading to him. Edmund had stepped into the garden to have a word with him, but his father only looked at him malevolently from his sunken eyes, mumbling and muttering in his beard. He was like an old monkey, Edmund thought, toothless and angry and feeble, and then suddenly he had struck out at him with the hand that still had free movement. Edmund had given him the rough side of his tongue for that, told him he must behave more prettily unless he wanted his allowance cut down. A nice way to behave to a son who gave him every penny he had. Thus pleasantly musing, he came out of this mean alley and crossed into the square. There were people about tonight, motors were moving this way and that, and a taxi was standing at the house next his, obstructing any further view of the road. Passing it, he saw that directly under the lamp-post opposite his own door there was drawn up an empty bath chair. Just behind it, as if waiting to push it when its occupant was ready, there was standing an old man with a straggling white beard. Peering at him, Edmund saw his sunken eyes and his mumbling mouth, and instantly came recognition. His latchkey slipped from his hand, and without waiting to pick it up, he stumbled up the steps, and in an access of uncontrollable panic, was plying bell and knocker and beating with his hands on the panel of his door. He heard a step within, and there was Alice, and he pushed by her, collapsing onto a chair in the hall. Before she closed the door and came to him, she smiled and kissed her hand to someone outside. It was with difficulty that they got him up to his bedroom, for though just now he had been so brisk, all power seemed to have left him. His thigh bones would scarce stir in their sockets, and he went up the stairs crabwise or corkscrew-wise, sidling and twisting as he mounted each step. At his direction, Alice closed and bolted his windows and drew the curtains across them. Not a word did he say about what he had seen, but indeed there was no need for that. Then, leaving him, she went to her own room, alert and eager, for who knew what might happen before day? How wise she had been to leave the working out of this in other hands. She had but concentrated and thought, and behold, her thoughts and the force that lay behind them were taking shape of their own in the material world. Fear, too, that great engine of destruction, had Edmund in its grip. He was caught in its invisible machinery, and was being drawn in among the relentless wheels. And still she must not interfere. She must go on hating him and wishing him ill. That had been a wonderful moment when he battered at the door in a frenzy of terror, and when, opening it, she saw outside the shabby old bath chair and her father standing behind it. She scarcely slept that night, but lay happy and nourished and tense, wondering if at any moment now the force might gather itself up for some stroke that would end all. But the short summer night brightened into day, and she went about her domestic duties again, so that everything should be comfortable for Edmund. Presently his servant came down with his master's orders to ring up Dr. Inglis. After the doctor had seen him, he again asked to speak to Alice. This repetition of his interview was lovely to her mind. It was like the re-entry of some musical motif in a symphony, and now it was decorated and amplified, for he took a much graver view of his patient. This sudden stiffening of his joints could not be accounted for by any physical cause, and there accompanied it a marked loss of power, which no bodily lesion explained. Certainly he had had some great shock, but of that he would not speak. Again the doctor asked her whether she knew anything of it, but all she could tell him was that he came in last night in a frightful state of terror and collapse. Then there was another thing. He was worrying himself over the speech he had to make at this general meeting. It was highly important that he should get some rest and sleep, and while that speech was on his mind, he evidently could not. He was therefore getting up and would come down to his sitting room, where he had the necessary papers. With the help of his servant he could manage to get there, and when his job was done he could rest quietly there, and Dr. Inglis would come back during the afternoon to see him again. Probably a week or two in a nursing home would be advisable. He told Alice to look in on him occasionally, and if anything alarmed her she must send for him. Soon he went upstairs again to help Edmund to come down, and there were the sounds of heavy treads and the creaking of banisters, as if some dead weight was being moved. That brought back to Alice the memory of her father's funeral, and the carrying of the coffin down the narrow stairs of the little house which his son's bounty had provided for him. She went with her brother and the doctor into his sitting room and established him at the table. The room looked out onto the high wall garden at the back of the house, and a long French window, opening to the ground, communicated with it. A plane tree in full summer foliage stood just outside, and on this sultry overcast morning the room was dim, with the dusky green light that filters through a screen of leaves. His table was strewn with his papers, and he sat in a chair with its back to the window. In that curious and sombre light his face looked strangely colourless, and the movements of his hands among his papers seemed to falter and stumble. Alice came back an hour later, and there he sat still busy and without a word for her, and she turned on the electric light, for it had grown darker, and she closed the open window, for now rain fell heavily. As she fastened the bolt, she saw that the figure of her father was standing just outside, not a yard away. He smiled and nodded to her. He put his finger to his lips as if enjoining silence. Then he made a little gesture of dismissal to her, and she left the room, just looking back as she shut the door. Her brother was still busy with his work, and the figure outside had come close up to the window. She longed to stop, she longed to see with her own eyes what was coming, but it was best to obey that gesture and go. The hall outside was very dark, and she stood there a moment listening intently. Then from the door which she had just shut there came, unmistakably, the click of a turn key, and again there was silence, but for the drumming of the rain and the splash of overflowing gutters. Something was imminent. Would the silence be broken by some protest of mortal agony, or would the gutters continue to gurgle till all was over? And then the silence within was shattered. There came the sound of Edmund's voice rising higher and more hoarse in some incoherent babble of entreaty, and suddenly, as it rose to a scream, it ceased as if a tap had been turned off. Inside there, something fell with a thump that shook the solid floor, and up the stairs from below came Edmund's servant. "What was that, miss?" he said in a scared whisper, and he turned the handle of the door. "Why, the master's locked himself in." "Yes, he's busy," said Alice. "Perhaps he doesn't want to be disturbed. But I heard his voice too, and then the sound of something falling. Tap at the door and see if he answers." The man tapped and paused and tapped again. Then from inside came the click of a turned key, and they entered. The room was empty. The light still burned on his table, but the chair where she had left him 5 minutes before was pushed back, and the window she had bolted was wide. Alice looked out into the garden, and that was as empty as the room. But the door of the shed where her father's bath chair was kept stood open, and she ran out into the rain and looked in. Edmund was lying in it with head lolling over the side. In the end,